My son's husband invited 60 guests to his birthday on my farm, but I wasn't invited. My name is Margaret Holloway, and for 41 years I have woken up before sunrise on the same 400 acres in the hill country, the same farm my grandfather cleared with a mule and a stubborn streak, the same farm where I raised my only son alone after his father's tractor rolled in a flash flood the spring Daniel turned 9. I want to tell you this story slowly, because it took me a long time to understand it myself, and because I think somewhere in the middle of it, there is something you might need to hear too. Whether you are a mother, a father, a son, or someone who loves a person the world still finds reasons to whisper about. Daniel was always a gentle boy, the kind who cried when the barn cat had kittens because he was so happy, the kind who read paperback novels under the porch light long after he should have been asleep, the kind of son who noticed when I was tired before I noticed it myself. When he was 17, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands wrapped so tight around a glass of milk that his knuckles went white, and he told me he was gay. I will be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing worth offering in a story like this. I did not handle it perfectly. I did not say anything cruel, but I went quiet in a way that I think frightened him more than anger would have, because silence from a mother can feel like a door closing even when you don't mean it that way. I spent that whole night awake, staring at the ceiling, not because I loved him less, but because I was afraid of a world I did not understand yet, afraid of what people in our small town would say, afraid for him in a way that came out looking like rejection, when really it was just fear wearing the wrong clothes. It took me 3 days to find the right words, and when I finally did, I drove out to the east pasture where he'd gone to be alone with the horses, and I said the only thing that mattered, which was that he was my son before he was anything else, and that would never change, not once, not ever. I wish I could tell you that was the end of the hard part, but fear doesn't leave all at once. It leaves in small pieces, over years, and Daniel and I had to rebuild something between us slowly, brick by brick, the way you'd repair a fence line after a bad storm. He went off to state college 2 years later, and I missed him the way you miss a limb. But I was proud, prouder than I let on, because he was becoming exactly who he was always meant to be, unafraid in ways I had never managed myself. It was in his second year of college that he met Ethan Reyes, a quiet, sharp-eyed young man studying agricultural engineering, of all things, a boy who had grown up in a cramped apartment 2 states away and had never once touched dirt that belonged to his own family. Daniel brought him home the first time during a Thanksgiving break, and I remember standing in the kitchen doorway watching Ethan help Daniel's grandmother, my own mother, carry a casserole dish to the table without being asked, and something in me softened right then, because you can tell a great deal about a person by how they treat the people who can do nothing for them in return. Over the next 2 years, Ethan became a fixture at our table, sitting a little too straight at first, laughing a little too carefully, the way people do when they are still deciding whether a place will let them stay. I tried, in my own clumsy way, to make him feel like he belonged, teaching him how to mend a fence, how to tell when a cow was close to calving, how to make my mother's biscuit recipe without a single measuring cup. But I will admit, because this story only works if I am honest with you, that there were moments early on where my fear leaked out sideways. Small comments I thought were harmless at the time. A joke about grandchildren that landed wrong. A worried aside to my sister on the phone that Ethan overheard through a cracked door one Christmas Eve. Words about hopping Daniel wasn't rushing into something so young. Words I meant as a mother's ordinary worry, and Ethan heard as a mother's ordinary rejection. I did not know he had heard them. I did not know for years that a wound had been made that night, quiet and small, the kind that doesn't bleed but doesn't close either, the kind that just sits under the skin and waits. Daniel and Ethan married on this farm 5 years ago, under the old oak by the pond where my own parents had married 60 years before them, and I stood at the front row in a blue dress. My sister helped me pick out, and I cried the way mothers cry at weddings, from somewhere so deep it surprised even me. I remember the toast Daniel's college roommate gave that afternoon, how he talked about the first time he met Ethan in a cramped dormitory hallway, both of them nervous freshmen from very different worlds, and how he had watched a shy engineering student slowly become someone who could stand up in front of 200 people and promise his whole life to another man without his voice shaking once. And I remember thinking, watching Daniel's face as he listened, that whatever fear I had once carried about this life for my son had been answered many times over simply by the steadiness in his eyes that day. My own mother, Daniel's grandmother, frail by then but sharp as ever, held my hand through the whole ceremony and whispered partway through that she wished my husband could have seen this, could have seen how much love could still grow on this same stretch of land even after losing him so young. And I squeezed her hand back because I did not trust my voice enough to answer her out loud just then. After the ceremony, while the caterers set up under the string lights for the reception, I stood near the pond alone for a few minutes, looking back at the old oak, and I thought, foolishly perhaps, that the hardest chapters were behind us, that love had won the way it's supposed to in the stories we tell ourselves, and for a while it seemed true. Ethan finished his degree and came to work the farm alongside Daniel and me, bringing in new irrigation methods that saved us more water in one season than we'd saved in a decade. And I began to see him not as my son's husband, but as my son, full stop, another child the farm had somehow given me in my later years. We built a small guest house on the north side of the property for them, close enough to visit, far enough for privacy. And for 3 years, life had a rhythm to it that felt almost like peace. It was not a peace without any friction at all, because no family is without friction, and ours had its own particular pressures living out in a small farming county where everyone knew everyone else's business before it had even finished happening. My late husband's sister, my sister-in-law Colleen, had never quite made her peace with Daniel's marriage the way I had, and she had a habit of saying things at family gatherings that she framed as jokes, but that landed like small stones thrown carelessly into still water. At my mother's 80th birthday supper, Colleen asked loudly across the table whether Ethan was planning to take Daniel's last name or keep his own, phrased in a tone that suggested the answer mattered more than it should have. And I watched Ethan's jaw tighten while he answered politely that they had not decided, and I said nothing at the time, which I now understand was its own kind of failure. There were other moments too, small ones. A church acquaintance who stopped inviting us to the annual harvest potluck the year after the wedding. A feed store clerk in town who grew suddenly formal and distant with Daniel after years of easy friendliness. Nothing large enough to fight over directly, but enough small cuts that I think Ethan carried more of that quiet weight than I ever fully understood. Weight he carried mostly alone since he did not want to burden Daniel with every slight. And weight he certainly never brought to me, because by then he had already learned, whether he could name it or not, that I was not always a safe place to bring his hurt. But somewhere in that third year, something shifted, slowly enough that I did not notice until it had already changed shape. Ethan grew quieter around me again, the way he had been at that first Thanksgiving, careful, measured, polite in a way that felt less like comfort and more like distance. I told myself it was stress. The farm had taken a hit that year from a dry summer, and money worries can make anyone withdrawn. I did not ask him directly what was wrong, and that, I think now, was my second mistake, the first being that comment all those years ago that I did not even remember making. Daniel's 30th birthday was approaching that spring, and I began planning quietly in my head the way I always did, a simple supper, maybe some of the cousins. A cake from the bakery in town that Daniel loved as a boy. I mentioned it to him over coffee one morning in April, something small and warm, and he smiled and said Ethan already had something planned, and I felt a small flutter of relief, because it meant less for me to organize during calving season, and I did not think anything more of it. Weeks passed. I noticed delivery trucks coming up the long drive more often than usual, tents being dropped off and stored in the far equipment barn, a caterer's van parked near the guest house one Tuesday afternoon while I was out checking the herd. I asked Daniel about it once lightly, the way you ask about something you assume you already understand, and he said Ethan wanted to surprise everyone, that it was going to be bigger than we expected, and he looked so happy saying it that I let the question go, tucking my curiosity away the way you tuck away a worry you've decided not to feed. Looking back, there were smaller signs even before that conversation that I brushed past too quickly. A few weeks earlier, I had invited Daniel and Ethan to Sunday supper, the way I did most weeks, and Ethan had begged off, saying he had paperwork for the co-op to finish, though Daniel came alone looking a little tired around the eyes, the way people look when they have just come from an argument they are trying not to carry into the next room. I asked him if everything was all right between them, and he said it was, just a stressful season, and I believed him because I wanted to, and because it is easier to believe the answer that lets you keep doing your chores in peace than the one that asks you to stop and look closer. My cousin Beatrice, who ran the flower shop in town, mentioned to me at the grocery store that she had taken a large order for greenery and centerpieces, 60 settings worth, she said, delivery scheduled for the farm, and I remember laughing and saying that sounded like an awful lot of flowers for a family supper, and she gave me an odd look, the kind of look people give you when they assume you already know something you clearly do not. But she did not correct me, and I did not ask her to, and we both went on with our shopping, as if nothing at all was strange about it. It was my neighbor, Ruth Ann, who told me the truth of it, 2 weeks before the party, leaning over the fence line while I was mending a broken post, mentioning almost in passing that she had received a beautiful invitation in the mail, 60 guests. She said, catering trucks, a live band, string lights strung across the whole back pasture, all of it happening right here on my farm, on land my grandfather had cleared with his own 2 hands. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, when the party was, and she told me the date, a Saturday 3 weeks out, the same Saturday I had circled on my own kitchen calendar for Daniel's birthday. I asked her if she knew who was hosting it, and she said Ethan, of course. Wasn't it wonderful that he'd organized something so grand for Daniel? I stood there at that fence line for a long moment after she walked away, feeling something cold settle into my chest, because I had not received an invitation, not a card in the mail, not a mention over dinner, nothing at all, and this was happening on my own land. Land I still held the deed to. Land my family had worked for 4 generations, and no one had thought to tell me I would need to make other plans for that Saturday, let alone that I might not be welcome at all. Word travels fast in a county this small, and within days it seemed half the town had heard some version of the story before I had even fully processed it myself. Ruth Ann, bless her, had not meant any harm by mentioning it, but she was not the only one who knew, and soon I began noticing sideways glances at the feed store, a pause in conversation when I walked into the diner on Main Street, the particular kind of silence that tells you people are talking about you and stopping only because you walked in. My cousin Beatrice called to ask, gently, if everything was all right between me and the boys, and I told her I did not know yet, because I did not, and she said that whatever was happening, she hoped we would find our way through it, because she had watched this family go through harder things than a birthday party and come out the other side. Some of it stung more than I expected, not because the town's opinion mattered more than my own family, but because it made the wound feel public in a way that made it harder to sit with privately, harder to think through without imagining what everyone else assumed about why my own son's husband had left me off a guest list for a party happening on my own land. I did not want to believe it was intentional. I told myself there had been a mistake, that invitations get lost, that Daniel surely assumed I already knew, that this was simply an oversight born of excitement and busy schedules and nothing more sinister than that. But the days went on, and no invitation appeared, and no one mentioned it to me directly, and the silence itself began to feel like an answer I did not want to hear. I thought back over the past year, searching for some clue I might have missed, some conversation that had gone differently than I remembered. And slowly, painfully, I began to recall things I had not let myself examine too closely before. The way Ethan sometimes left a room when I entered it. The way certain family gatherings had grown smaller and smaller over the past 2 years without my quite noticing the pattern. The way Daniel had started visiting me alone more often instead of the two of them coming together the way they used to. I did not confront anyone right away. I am not a woman who confronts easily, not because I lack courage, but because I have learned over a long life that anger spoken too quickly often says less true a thing than patience spoken later. So I waited, and I watched, and I let the hurt sit in me the way you let a bruise sit before you touch it, testing how deep it goes. 10 days before the party, I finally sat Daniel down at the kitchen table, the same table where he had once told me who he was at 17 years old, and I asked him plainly whether I was invited to his birthday celebration happening on my own land. I watched his face change, confusion first, then something like dawning horror, and he said, "Mom, of course you're invited. This is your farm, why would you even ask that?" And I told him gently that no invitation had come, that Ruth Ann across the fence had one and I did not, that I had heard about tents and bands and 60 guests from a neighbor rather than my own son. Daniel went very still, and then he got up from the table without another word and walked straight out toward the guest house, and I did not follow him, because some conversations are not mine to referee. I do not know everything that was said between Daniel and Ethan that afternoon, because I was not in the room, and I think it is important in telling you this story that I do not pretend to know more than I do. But Daniel came to me that evening, his eyes red-rimmed, and he told me what he had learned, which was that Ethan had planned the entire event deliberately without including me, not out of forgetfulness, but out of a wound he had been carrying since that Christmas Eve years earlier, the overheard comment about rushing into marriage too young, a wound that had festered quietly under a surface of politeness for years while I remained entirely unaware it existed. Ethan had told Daniel that he loved me, that he did not wish me harm, but that he had spent years feeling like a guest in his own marriage, tolerated rather than truly welcomed, and that this party, this one day, he had wanted to belong somewhere fully, surrounded by his own friends and chosen family, without the weight of feeling measured by a mother-in-law he was not sure had ever fully accepted him. Hearing this secondhand through my son broke something open in me. Not anger, though there was some of that too, but grief. A deep and specific grief for a wound I had caused without meaning to, and then failed to notice for years. A wound that had grown large enough to reshape a family gathering into an act of quiet exclusion. I did not defend myself to Daniel that night. I simply asked him to give me a few days before I did anything at all, because I needed to sit with what I had learned rather than react to it. And Daniel, to his credit, respected that request, though I could see how badly he wanted the two people he loved most to simply be at peace with one another. I spent the next several days doing the hardest work I think I have ever done on this farm, harder than birthing calves in a January blizzard, harder than burying my husband, which was sitting still with my own failures and looking at them honestly instead of explaining them away. I remembered that Christmas Eve conversation with my sister more clearly than I wanted to, and I realized, turning it over and over, that what I had said had been true to my fear but cruel in its effect, that intention and impact are two very different things, and that I had spent years assuming my later kindness had erased an earlier wound I did not even know I had inflicted. I wrote Ethan a letter, because I did not trust myself to say everything correctly out loud without stumbling into more clumsy words. I wrote about that Christmas Eve, admitting I remembered saying something I should not have said, admitting that my fear at the time had nothing to do with him as a person, and everything to do with my own unfamiliarity with a world that was changing faster than I was, admitting that this was my failure to correct, not his failure to forgive quickly enough. I wrote about how proud I was of the man he had become, how grateful I was for the way he loved my son, how the farm had become better, richer, more alive because of the two of them building a life on it together. I wrote that I understood if he needed time, if he needed the party to be his and Daniel's alone this year, but that I hoped, someday, there would be room again for all of us at the same table. I left the letter on the guest house steps early one morning before the sun came up, the way I used to leave notes for Daniel when he was small and sneaking out to watch meteor showers, and I did not wait around to see it found. 3 days passed without a word, and I told myself that was all right, that healing does not run on anyone else's timetable but the person doing the healing, and I busied myself with the spring planting, trying not to watch the calendar too closely as the birthday drew nearer. On the fourth day, Ethan came to the main house, standing at my kitchen door the way he had that very first Thanksgiving, a little too straight, a little too careful, except this time there were tears standing in his eyes rather than nerves. And before he said anything else, I noticed he was holding my letter, folded soft at the creases the way paper gets when it has been opened and closed many times. And he told me he had read the letter more times than he wanted to admit, and that he was sorry too. Sorry for carrying a wound in silence for years instead of speaking it aloud when it was fresh and small and easier to mend. Sorry for letting a party become a weapon when all he had really wanted, underneath all of it, was to matter to me the way Daniel always had. We stood in that kitchen for a long while, not saying very much else at first, because some moments do not need many words. They only need two people willing to stop protecting themselves long enough to be honest. Eventually, I asked him to sit down with me at the table, and I made 2 cups of coffee the way my mother used to, strong and a little too sweet, and we talked for almost 2 hours, longer than we had ever talked alone in all the years he had lived on this land. He told me about growing up in that cramped apartment 2 states away, about a father who had left early and a mother who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, about how the first time he ever felt like he belonged to a place with roots was the day Daniel brought him out to the east pasture and taught him to tell a healthy calf from a struggling one, and how badly he had wanted that feeling of belonging to be permanent, unshakable. The kind that could not be undone by an overheard sentence on a Christmas Eve years ago. He told me he understood now that fear and rejection can look identical from the outside, even when they come from entirely different places inside a person, and that he wished he had found the courage to ask me directly what I meant instead of carrying an assumption quietly for years, the way a splinter works itself deeper under the skin the longer it goes untouched. I told him that I wished I had noticed his quiet distance sooner, and asked him about it instead of telling myself it was only stress or a busy season, and that I understood now how easy it is for a family to drift into separate silences without ever meaning to, each person assuming the other one already knows how much they are loved. We agreed, sitting there over coffee gone lukewarm, that we would try, both of us, to say the hard things out loud from now on, even when it felt easier to swallow them, because a farm this old had already taught us both that the things left buried too long tend to surface eventually, usually at the worst possible moment, and it is far kinder to everyone involved to dig them up early and in the light. He told me, eventually, that he wanted me at the party, that he had already begun quietly rearranging the seating and the guest list in his head over the past 2 days, that this had never really been about excluding me forever, only about a wound that had grown so large in silence that it needed a single dramatic gesture to finally be seen. I told him I did not need a grand gesture, only the truth, and that the truth he had just given me was worth more than any invitation could have been. The following Saturday came bright and warm, the kind of spring day that makes even old farmland look new again, and I woke before dawn out of habit, and I walked out to the barn to do my chores as I always had, and when I came back up toward the house near mid-morning, I found 60 folding chairs being arranged in neat rows across the back pasture, string lights being tested against the daylight, a long buffet table going up under the old oak where Daniel and Ethan had married 5 years before. Daniel found me near the fence line around noon, his face soft in a way I had not seen in weeks, and he handed me an envelope, cream-colored, my name written on the front in Ethan's careful engineering student handwriting. And inside was a single card that simply said, "There is no celebration on this land without you. Please come as our family, not our guest." I cried reading it, standing there in my work boots with dirt still under my fingernails, and I went inside and put on the blue dress from Daniel's wedding, the one I had kept folded carefully in the cedar chest, because some clothes are meant to be worn more than once when they carry that much meaning. The party that evening was everything Ethan had planned. 60 guests laughing under string lights, a small band playing songs that made the older folks dance, and the younger folks roll their eyes affectionately. A cake 3 tiers tall that Daniel cut with the same pocket knife his father had once used to cut fence wire on this very land. I sat at the head table between my son and his husband, not at the edge of the celebration but in the very center of it, and at one point, Ethan stood up with a glass in his hand and asked for quiet, and he thanked everyone for coming, and then he looked directly at me and said that this farm had given him more than land or a career. It had given him a family that chose, more than once, to keep choosing him even when the choosing was hard, and he said he hoped, someday, to be even half as patient with the people he loved as I had finally learned to be with him. I will not pretend that one letter and one party solved every old wound between us, because that is not how real families work. Real healing is slower and messier than that, built over months of small gestures rather than one perfect evening. But that Saturday was a beginning, a real one, the kind you can build a future on the way you build a fence, post by post, plank by plank, testing each one before you trust your whole weight to it. In the 2 years since that birthday, Ethan and I have grown close in a way I never expected when he first sat too straight at my Thanksgiving table all those years ago. Close in the ordinary way that matters most, arguing over the right way to fix a gate hinge, laughing over burnt biscuits, standing together at the fence line at dusk watching the cattle settle for the night. Daniel says now that this is the farm he always hoped we could become, a place where love did not have to prove itself over and over to be believed, a place where mistakes could be named honestly and repaired rather than buried under years of polite silence. Last spring, Ethan and Daniel told me they were hopping to adopt, and they asked, with a nervousness that broke my heart a little, whether I would want to be a grandmother to whoever came into our family that way. And I told them there was no question in the world I had ever wanted answered more clearly than that one. This past winter, we welcomed a little girl named after my own grandmother, and I held her for the first time in the same rocking chair where I had once held Daniel as an infant, on the same porch where he had once cried over kittens, on the same land my grandfather cleared with nothing but a mule and a stubborn kind of hope. I think about that Christmas Eve often now, the words I said that I did not even remember saying, and I think about how a single sentence, spoken carelessly out of fear, can sit quietly in someone's heart for years, growing heavier in the silence, until it finally has to come out somehow, sometimes gently, sometimes as loudly as 60 guests, and a string quartet on a family farm. I do not think Ethan was wrong to feel what he felt, even if the way it surfaced frightened me at first, because pain deserves to be witnessed eventually, one way or another, and I am only grateful that when it finally surfaced, we were both willing to sit inside the discomfort of it rather than run from each other. If there is anything I hope you take from this story, it is this: that love is rarely tested in the grand, dramatic moments we imagine it will be tested in. It is tested instead in 1,000 small choices, in the comments we make without thinking, in the silences we let stretch too long, in whether we are willing, when the wound finally surfaces, to meet it with more honesty than defensiveness. My son found a good man to build a life with, a man who taught this old farm new tricks, and taught this old woman that it is never too late to say I was wrong and mean it fully. We still work this land together, the three of us, soon to be four, and every spring when the fields turn green again, I am reminded that some of the strongest things that grow here were never planted in easy soil to begin with. They had to be tended through drought and doubt, and one very long, very necessary reckoning under a string of lights on a warm Saturday evening, before they were finally allowed to bloom the way they were always meant to. Colleen came around too, in her own slow the way people from a certain generation often do, not with a dramatic apology but with small quiet gestures that meant more than words might have. Bringing a casserole to the farm the week after the party without being asked, sitting a little closer to Ethan at the next holiday supper, asking him once, almost shyly, to explain how the new irrigation system worked because she had heard it was saving the whole county money on well water. I do not think she ever said the word sorry out loud, not in so many words, but I watched her effort, and I decided that effort itself was its own kind of apology, the kind some people are only capable of giving, and I chose to accept it in the spirit it was offered rather than demanding a version of contrition she did not have the language for. The town settled too, the way small towns eventually do, the whispers fading into ordinary conversation again, once there was nothing new left to whisper about. And by the following harvest festival, Ethan was manning the co-op booth right alongside Daniel, the two of them laughing with the same feed store clerk who had once gone cold and formal, because time and steadiness have a way of wearing down even the stubbornest kinds of discomfort. When Daniel and Ethan first mentioned adoption to me, sitting on the porch on a warm evening with the fireflies just starting to rise up out of the grass, I could see how carefully they had rehearsed the conversation. The way you rehearse something you are afraid might be taken from you before you even finish asking. I told them there was no version of that conversation where my answer could have been anything but yes, and I meant it with my whole chest, because somewhere between that painful spring and this quiet evening, I had learned that family is not a fixed shape handed down from tradition. It is something built, chosen, and rebuilt every single day by the people willing to keep showing up for one another honestly. The adoption process took the better part of a year. Home visits and paperwork and long stretches of waiting that tested all of our patience. And I spent that year doing what I could to help, clearing out the old sewing room to become a nursery, driving into the city twice to sit with Daniel and Ethan through meetings that made them both nervous enough to need an extra steady hand nearby. When the caseworker finally called with news of a little girl who needed a home, 6 months old with a head full of dark curls, I drove to the guest house so fast I nearly ran over Ruth Ann's mailbox, and the three of us cried together in that small kitchen, the way families do when the waiting finally ends. We named her Adeline, after my own grandmother, the woman whose biscuit recipe I had once taught Ethan to make without a single measuring cup, and I like to think some circles in a family close themselves without anyone planning it that way, generations folding back into each other on the same stretch of land. This past winter, on a cold January evening much like the one my husband did not live to see grow old in, I sat in the rocking chair on the porch with Adeline asleep against my shoulder, and Daniel came out to check on us, and he told me quietly that he was glad I had been brave enough to write that letter instead of simply forgiving Ethan in silence the way I might have a few years earlier, because a forgiveness that is never spoken out loud is only half a forgiveness. The other half left for someone else to guess at forever. I think about that often now, how close we came to losing something we did not even know was breaking, and how grateful I am that a birthday party gone sideways became, instead, the very thing that finally taught this old farm and this old woman how to tell the truth a little sooner next time.